Hugh Patterson, who will talk about keyboard layout as part of language documentation in the case of Me'phaa, I hope I'm pronouncing these right, in the case of Me'phaa and Chinantec keyboards. Is that something close to it? Or?
Something close. So it's pronounced Me'phaa. There's 4 varieties, they all pronounce it differently. So, however, and Chinantec, it's, let's see if I can say this correctly, Sociopum Chinantec. I was there working on a language documentation project in Me'phaa, and I'll explain that a little bit as I get into this. We don't need that. Yeah, I use Bitly, so. Let's see. So basically, I want to approach this from the perspective that keyboards are a tool. And you need the right tools to get the jobs done that we have to do, or we choose to do. You might remember about a month ago, there was a transit of Venus across the sun, and you may have had an opportunity to see it if you had the right tools. So if you had some dark glasses kind of like this, then you might have been able to see it. Well, a buddy of mine and I, we went out and we tried to go photograph this transit of Venus, but we didn't have the right tools. Well, we did get a pretty good shot. So, but it is, the issue is you have to have the right tools. And that's, I've loved this conference for this reason, because talking about right tools and getting jobs done. But I want to point out to another issue is that users of tools don't want to know how they work. They just want to use them. And it's kind of like polarized sunglasses. You know, they block light, they let you see more clearly. But you don't want to, the people who buy these sunglasses don't want to know that there's iodine in the glasses that blocks all the sun reflection. So they just want a product that actually works. And they just want it to be intuitive and use it. So my first talk on keyboards is going to bring some of those elements in as well. But I think in language documentation, and as we approach the language endangerment movement, or the language documentation movement and the language endangerment issue, we have to ask ourselves, what is the effect we want to have on the speakers of an endangered language? So it's not, I don't think in today's day and age that we can actually stand by and say, we just want to be observers. You know, we're actually saying we want to get our hands wet, we want to do something, we want to make a change. So the observer's paradox is not a paradox, it's a challenge for engagement. And for many of us, it starts in the digital medium with the keyboard, with data input of some kind. Now, in audio and video, you're bypassing this tactile method. But looking at the design process and the user experience is kind of what brings a keyboard. And it's kind of I think, the last thing that we think about in terms of keyboards. It is, you know, it's just, we just don't think about it as a tool very much. I've been asked by a couple of people to design them keyboards, and got one fellow in, I think it's Tajikistan, he's working on language, he's called me up and he's like, I'm supposed to go over there this summer, you want to build me a keyboard? Here's my orthography. Well, this is a bigger issue than we might think. So where are these two languages? Well, on the southern tip of Mexico, Me'phaa is down here in the mountains toward about 50 miles from the coast, and then Sociopum Chinantec is up there on number 9. And the challenge with keyboards is that you got to bring in you got to make the input match in orthography. So to kind of give us an idea of what the Me'phaa orthography looks like, kind of looks like this. Now, to run my experiment, I took 4 texts. They're Bible texts, the book of James. And that's what I took them because they're semantically close, they're available. Some people have mentioned, you know, Bibles as corpora. That's kind of what I'm using as. So it's a three-tone language. The acute accent is a high tone, underscores a low tone, unmarked vowel is a mid-tone. The nasalized the nasalized N is a palatal nasal, and then the satiu is a glottal stop. And Sochiapam, they have a three-tone system as well, and they mark it differently. They mark it with numbers at the end of the syllable, and they have, in Chinantec languages, they have something called ballistic syllables, and this is akin to stress. So that's marked with an acute accent, and then glottal stops are marked with H. So just kind of so you see what we're talking about here a little bit. I think that's pretty much all the craziness of the orthographies. Some of the challenges that we face when we think about keyboards, there's a variety of things, and we have detached keyboards, you know, maybe like this right here. We've got keyboards that are set firm on your computer like a laptop. Now we have virtual keyboards with tablets, and that would be, you know, iPad is my tool of choice, but they're all different. So you have different input methods now with iOS, and where you can hold down a key and then you get some alternates that with diacritics and such. It's pretty cool. I mean, when you think about challenges of keyboarding diacritics. But when we come to a keyboard, we have several different user experience levels that we interface with the keyboard at. We have a visual level, so kind of what's printed on the surface of the keys. We have a tactile level, so if I'm using dead keys to input diacritics or something like that, or how many fingers go where on the keyboard, how often. We have a software layer kind of like underneath the keyboard in between the computer. So if we're using a virtual keyboard experience, we basically the keyboard setup however it is, and then you want to change that to something else. So that's the software. But then you also have a feedback output, which is a visual kind of thing back to the user. So in the Mexico context, we have two types of keyboards that we deal with. We have an ANSI QWERTY keyboard, which is the North American, US, I should say, not necessarily in Canada, but it's a US standard keyboard. And then we have the Spanish ISO keyboard. And the major differences are down here on the return key, and then over here we have the ISO keyboard, which is also used throughout Europe. Here is got an extra key. So this has actually an additional key than that one, and one of the keys here is placed on top of the return key. So in designing a keyboard, one of our challenges was to design a keyboard that worked on both, because in Mexico you have a lot of computers that come down from the US into Mexico, and indigenous people get these computers as well. So I mean, we're not just talking about expatriates, but we're talking about a variety of types of computers among indigenous peoples. And so to bring the final product kind of to the front of the talk, so I can go back and talk about some of the challenges. These are the base state of the keyboard. In the keyboard you have different states when you do dead keys, right, and you flip and such like this. So the orange ones are the dead keys, and this is kind of, there's a little bit of history on each of these. In the Me'phaa case, there's a font that the community was using. It's a Unicode font, but before it was Unicode, it was non-Unicode. And then they didn't have a keyboard, so they hacked Unicode so that when a Spanish ISO keyboard was used, the keys to input things would show up if you used the font. So in essence, they matched Unicode symbols, and so it wasn't straight up Unicode. In the Sochiapam case, no one had ever designed an OS X keyboard for that yet. So one of the guys in the literacy program there in Xochitl asked me to make his computer work in Chinantec, so I did. So that's how, those are kind of the, in the Xochitl case, there was a program called Keyman. Some of you may know it. It works on Windows and it allows you to build keyboards, custom keyboard layouts. So I in essence copied that, but we had to take a couple of things into consideration. I'm going to approach this from a design perspective. Dieter Rams is a design guru in the design world for industrial design. And he has 10 things, and 4 of those I find really useful in talking about keyboards. He says good design is design that makes a product useful and it makes it understandable. The product is unobtrusive and is thorough down to the last detail. So in computer products and software, useful versus usable is a big challenge. And so user experience would dictate that it needs to be useful and pleasurable to use. The last thing you want to do is create software that actually does something that's really needed, but people hate to use it, because then they don't use it. So what is, if we take that to the keyboard level and say, well, yes, XYZ community, we built you a keyboard, you can type in your language, but then it's really difficult to type. Are they going to type in their language? Probably less likely to. Yes, it still has some prestige, but the amount of effort is probably not going to bring it to the language use to a sustainable level. And some of those issues are the right characters in the base state. So are they the most frequently used characters in the base state? The keys, are they in the right places? The more often used keys are they in the more agile digits? Are they closer to the center of the keyboard? That kind of thing. Another challenge is the keyboard related to the majority language keyboard? So in a Francophone country, if you're using a French ISO keyboard, are you going to be able to bring those characters from the French keyboard into the orthography? Or if you're in our case, we're working with the Spanish ISO keyboard. So what is the relationship between the orthography and the Mexican orthography and that? So it's not just the orthography, but the keyboards and the layouts. What are the transferable skills for the typist when they come to this? Dead key feedback is another issue. On a Windows computer, when you type a dead key, you don't get it highlighted, the accent diacritic highlighted in yellow. On an OS X computer, you do. But the idea to tell the user that, hey, something new is happening, they don't get lost. The visual feedback is very important for new computer users and is helpful to all of us. So is the keyboard intuitive to use? Is it understandable? Is there a visual correspondence between input and output? So is the keyboard surface that they're looking at going to produce the characters that they're going to see on the screen? One of the issues in the Me'phaa text that I analyzed, and we didn't find this out until I analyzed the text, is that in Me'phaa they have the double angle brackets for quote marks, and kind of like French and Spanish style. And the user had been using single angle brackets and hitting it twice, because that's the symbol that looks like what they're expecting on the screen. So maybe that's something where the key needed to be keyed as a dead key, so if you hit it twice, then it turns into the double quotes. The same operating behavior across the operating system. So if I build something on OS X, when I build it again for Windows, I should have transferable skills and the behavior should be the same across those. Vendor keys are different across the operating system. So on Mac, command key is often used instead of control, but that means that when you go over to the Windows side, if you're using the dead key as control for something, what are you going to use on the Mac side? So the understandable issue also goes deeper than just the physical tactile bit. It goes into the character composition, I think, as well. And that is, like in this inye, is it, in the mind of the writer, is it in plus the diacritic, or is it a completely separate character? And that kind of parallel should be expressed tactilely on the keyboard as well, optimally. Sometimes it's not possible, but optimally it would be. And we have that kind of issue with the accent because it's used for different things in Spanish and Me'phaa. We also have that issue with the barred I with accent. And this is a little bit challenging in Unicode to implement because in the orthography of Me'phaa and Chinantec, it's dotless I plus an overlay strike plus a grave accent, or acute accent. And in the Windows world, there's a really nice keyboard layout editor by Microsoft. And it only allows you to do one character at a time, but a dead key you can then sequence two. And we cannot figure out how to do three. So I've been able to implement this on OS X, but I can't implement it on Microsoft with their keyboard layout editor. But that's why I guess a lot of people use Keyman or another program called InKey. But then that brings a level of complexity to the computing situation when you have to have another program so that you can type in your indigenous language, which is not exactly optimal design. So it brings a set of challenges, and that's where sometimes it takes us as language documenters to be advocates to software companies who are developing this, like Microsoft, and say, hey, what about the linguistic needs of the indigenous people? And they come back and they say, oh, well, that's not markedly viable. So it takes a little bit more advocacy than just a one-time thing. It's something that we need to be persistent about. So just to kind of see what we've got here, this is the Xochiapan, the Xochiapan keyboard, and because they run their tones on the first three numbers in the base state, those three numbers are actually separate Unicode characters. They're just not superscript. So they're actually keyed to the Unicode characters, and that's when you hit that top orange key, then you flip over to that keyboard. If you hit Shift, then in Xochiapan Chinantec, they also have a vowel that's diaeresis is above the E, or umlaut's above the E, and so you have to hit that to get Shift semicolon or Shift colon, and then you get the E. And then you get that. So that's like 3 keystrokes to get your vowel, which is, I don't like it. It's not. I don't like it from a design point of view. It's kind of, but when we're looking at that barred I with accent, there is one way to do it with 2 Unicode characters, but you'd have to instead of being an accented barred I, you have to think of it as a accented I with a stroke, which means you'd have to add another dead key, which is not optimal design again. So that's basically saying that having to work through the limitations of the OS software makes it obtrusive, and that is not exactly where we want to go in design or optimal computing experience for indigenous language writers. Now, in my paper I have 4 texts that I took. Parallel text, semantic contents, the same as their translations, and so you can see here we have word counts, and we have character counts, and then we have keystroke counts. So how many actual keystrokes does it take to get those characters? And then a relative efficiency rating for each keyboard. So the Me'phaa keyboard actually shows that it's a little bit more efficient, but when we actually start looking at some of the keyboards, let me flip over to the Me'phaa one first. you'll notice that in my paper I took the whole book of James, so that's the full text one, and then I took like 3 sentences, and that's the sample one. You'll notice that the A is really often used. It's the most common used vowel, and it's used by itself. It's used in high tone and low tone, and then N and I really show up as well. And then saltillo on the other side shows up a whole lot of times. So looking at the dispersion of characters, it's got a wide distribution, and it's not actually optimal for the fingers from that perspective. So just looking at the statistics isn't enough. You have to look at where you're hitting the keys. And Chinantec, the really often used key is the one there with the red H in the glottal, as the glottal stop. That's under the index finger, so it's kind of where it belongs. And then your tone marks on the left up here, the 1, 2, 3 are quite often used. So yeah, and you can get to those without dead keys. That's pretty ergonomically efficient. Comparatively on Spanish, the A or the E is pretty high, depending on if you look at the short sample or the full text. Then English QWERTY keyboard, our most common character in English is E. So, open up for questions.
Yeah, fantastic work. Thank you very much, Hugh, for a very thought-provoking talk, and I'm sure we've all got some questions, so let's open the floor.
Although not going too much off track here, but relating keyboards to fonts, especially for languages that don't use standard Roman or IPA stuff. Recently I had to do some work for Longline. And there's a situation we're talking about here with overlays, multiple overlays, and a couple of the times there'll be environment-based character changes. So you'll add a certain code of character, and then depending on the preceding character, it will change and overlap. And it's predictive. And the issue here was they can install the software like you're talking about, the proprietary software, and install it. And then you're limited on the fonts you can use with that keyboard at that point. And then, okay, you rendered your character, and it would break nearly every time, even though it was still abiding by what would be considered Unicode standards. And looking at your proposal here, you're saying, well, 3 character strokes is too much. But on the flip side, if you could generate that character, the preset 3-character string, especially for these languages with strange or smaller rendering characters, to me that's something that seems like a gain potentially. I'm curious what you think.
Yes. Well, I don't deal with non-Roman scripts. The guys I work with, I go down and talk to the people who do to help me understand these things. So I'm not sure exactly what Windows environment does with non-Roman scripts like that. And there is something inside of fonts for that smart technology to make things flip around. And I really don't have experience with that, so not to shoot you down.
I went too far off.
Yeah.
Great talk.
Out of my area, that's just easy.
I've actually got a related question.
Shoot.
So, given the possibilities that we've seen for developing uniquely appropriate keyboards for these endangered languages through the methodology that you described, for those endangered languages which don't currently have an established or even a tentative orthography, would your conclusions indicate that perhaps the most successful approach would be that the keyboards and therefore the orthography of the endangered languages as they're currently being developed, that they should be focused around the major language of a region? So for example, as Gabor was talking to us about Manchi at the beginning of the session, and you were suggesting Cyrillic keyboard, or Cyrillic script for Manchi as a viable way forward.
Yes.
Is that the sort of thing you'd be talking about? And say for the endangered languages that Emma was describing, we would use the kind of relevant Asian orthographies for that?
Well, orthography development is a social issue, and it's best described as the orthography describes the people, so whatever the people want, that's what should be used. that's kind of the best practice and kind of the accepted practice. Now, there is a paper in language documentation conservation out of Hawaii where the author makes a suggestion that orthography should use standard key, what they can find on a keyboard, that should be their standard. And I disagree. I think that it oversimplifies and it leads to technological imperialism. So I think when a linguistic symbol does best describe the environment, a linguistic symbol should be used. But this is where a linguist, in consultation with the language community, these are issues that they have to address. But you have to address the user experience element of computing in that language. Because the issue isn't that the orthography needs to change. The orthography needs to be vibrant to express the character of the people and the language itself. To make distinctions where distinctions need to be made, and make similarities where similarities need to be made. But there's a user experience element that needs to be addressed. And that can be addressed separately, but it cannot be forgotten.
Just a comment that it seems like when challenges are presented to researchers, then that's when innovation happens. And actually that's what pushes the creation of new tools. And so as minority languages gain status in this digital environment, it seems like those are challenges which then can be responded to, but without the desire for them, then there's no creation of those new things. And I think with touchscreen technology, for example, there's no reason that you couldn't have the specialized keyboard. So it's the distribution of technology that's the limitation right now, not so much the technology that's available, the availability of the tool.
I mean, I was wondering what you thought in terms of the touchscreen technology that you were discussing with iPads and iPhones has somewhat changed the game, but I was thinking of the conventional keyboard, for example, on an Apple MacBook. And I was thinking of, very frequently, if I'm typing in kind of Russian and Ukrainian rather than switching to a different keyboard, I just use the phonetic. You can have like a phonetic keyboard. Yeah. So the kind of the phonemes represented by English graphemes correspond to the relevant Russian and Ukrainian graphemes. And I initially thought when you were laying out these issues that perhaps that would be the best solution for some of these languages. You would do it on a kind of underlying phonetic basis. But I was wondering if you think that actually having these adaptive keyboards could play a crucial role in augmenting the prestige of these endangered languages to the point where it might stimulate revitalization into, or at least play a role in that.
Yes, I think it is important. I think it's crucially important because they need the speakers, the community members need to feel like they have ownership. So I think when they feel like they have the power to become writers, that's when they start. Your language and digital media is going to take new life and new directions. Without that, you're going to. So in regards to the question on phonetic versus completely independent, I think you're going to have to think in terms of. Phonetic requires a bit of linguistic awareness. It requires an awareness in two.
Bilingualism, basically.
It becomes biographical or graphical or whatever. And in a sense, because like you're talking about Cyrillic scripts, but I'm not talking about Cyrillic scripts in my examples. I'm talking because the symbols are the same in the Romanized orthographies. So. In Russia, computers are sold with, Cyrillic graphemes on them. If I understand the economic situation, like the marketing and such. So it's a little bit. Well, if Cyrillic's going to fit the character of your people group, your speaker base, then use Cyrillic.
Yeah.
So
my point was more just about the fact that, as you were saying, you can have a situation where you have different keystroke combinations to achieve a unique grapheme, or say a uniquely diacriticized grapheme, or alternatively, you can have it as a more visual presence on the keyboard if it is used integral and not compound by the users themselves. You gave that example of the nasal N, and if they view that as two separate components, or latter situation?
Yeah, it can be, I don't know exactly how to solve that problem in every situation. I know some places you can buy stickers, put on your, if you're learning how to keyboard and Thai or something like this, right? And you're coming from Western European context, but I'm not sure that that's a solution for every language group, but I mean, it's a cheap solution that is repeatable.
Exactly. Okay, and on that note, let's give a big thanks to you.